She stinks and she's not going to live here. My daughter-in-law said, but what my son did was shocking. There are things you hear that you can't believe are real, that it happened to a real person, in a real house, on the most anticipated day of a mother's life. But this story did happen, and when I learned every detail, I had to stop and ask myself where the world went so wrong that a woman could reach the point Mrs. Martha Sullivan reached that Saturday afternoon. She had spent the night on a bus, more than 6 hours sitting in a hard seat with the old brown leather suitcase on her lap because she was afraid of losing it if she put it underneath. It was everything she had brought, some carefully folded clothes, a Bible with a worn cover, 2 photos she had kept since the 70s, and a package of homemade cornbread she had made herself at dawn before catching the bus. She knew her son loved it. She hadn't told them she was coming, not because she didn't want to, but because she thought she didn't need to. David Sullivan was her son. The house was his, but she had helped pay for every brick of that place when the boy still had nothing to his name. She thought it was different from showing up at a stranger's door. She thought, the bus arrived early in the morning at the Greyhound station in Chicago, and Mrs. Martha Sullivan went straight to the nearest bus stop. She had the address written on a folded piece of paper inside her purse, in David Sullivan's own handwriting. Large, slanted handwriting she recognized from when he was 8 years old, writing his first little notes, asking to leave school early. She arrived in the neighborhood around noon. The heat was beating down hard, and her feet were swollen from the trip. But she straightened herself up as best she could when she recognized the gate. A spacious building, with a long hallway of pale, gleaming marble that reflected the light from inside. A beautiful house, a house she had helped bring into existence. She rang the doorbell once, then again. The door opened, and that's when the story changed direction in a way nobody expected. Brianna was wearing a white dress, a delicate lace dress, as if she had just come from some important engagement. Her hair loose, her green eyes wide with surprise. And behind her, David Sullivan, in a dark suit and blue shirt, his face set in a way his mother couldn't decipher, whether it was embarrassment or something else entirely. The two of them had just returned from an engagement dinner. Friends, Brianna's family, an expensive restaurant in Lincoln Park. And when they got home, not expecting anything at all, they found Mrs. Martha Sullivan there, with the brown suitcase and the wrapped cornbread, smiling like someone who had come for a Sunday visit. The problem is that for Brianna, it wasn't a Sunday visit. For Brianna, it was an intrusion. She raised her finger, pointed directly at her mother-in-law, and what came out of her mouth at that moment was etched into the memory of everyone who was on that sidewalk that afternoon. Because there was a neighbor at the window. There was a delivery man who had stopped out front with a box in his hand. And there was David Sullivan, who stood there in the middle of the hallway as if the floor had swallowed his feet. She stinks, Brianna said. She stinks, and she's not going to live here. Just send her away already. Mrs. Martha Sullivan didn't understand at first. She kept smiling, thinking her daughter-in-law had said something as a joke, or that she had heard wrong, because her ears sometimes played tricks on her. But Brianna repeated it, this time covering her nose with her hand, like someone standing near something unbearable. David Sullivan, I'm being serious. She's not coming in here like that. You said you'd take care of this. I had to stop right here when I first read it. Because that sentence, that last sentence of Brianna's, carries something we'll understand later on. That David Sullivan knew, that he had promised something. And Mrs. Martha Sullivan was in the middle of a situation that had begun long before she set foot on that sidewalk. David looked at his mother, then he looked at Brianna, and he lowered his head. Mrs. Martha Sullivan felt her legs grow heavy. It wasn't the exhaustion of the trip. It was that weight that older people recognize well, the weight of understanding that the ground has shifted beneath your feet and that no one is going to tell you when it happened. She was 73 years old, a widow for 8 years. She had spent the last 3 years living with her older sister, Mrs. Gladys, in a small town in the countryside where the streets were still dirt roads and everyone knew each other by nickname. But Mrs. Gladys had gotten sick. Her children had come to pick her up, and Martha was left alone in a house that wasn't hers, with a rent she wouldn't be able to pay. She had called David 3 weeks earlier. She had explained everything with that calm voice she had always used so as not to frighten her son. She had said she would need a corner, just a corner, until she got herself sorted out. David had said, "Mom, of course, you come." He had said that. She had heard it. But what she didn't know was that between the day he said it and the day she arrived, another conversation had taken place. A conversation between husband and wife, in a modern kitchen, with the gas burner on, and the two of them lowering their voices so they wouldn't argue loudly. Brianna had rules. Brianna had plans for that house that didn't include a mother-in-law living in the guest room. Brianna had told David that he needed to handle this another way. And David, who loved his wife and was afraid of the cold silence she imposed when she was upset, had promised he would handle it. Except he never called his mother. He never told her the plan had changed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Martha Sullivan stood still in that white hallway for what felt like far too long. The marble beneath her old feet, the light from the chandelier up on the ceiling, the smell of expensive cleaning products filling the air. She looked at her hands. She looked at her suitcase. Then she looked at her son. David. She said his name the way only a mother knows how to say it. Without anger. With a kind of question inside the word, a question that was at once, "What happened to you?" and "Did I do something wrong?" and "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." David raised his eyes. He was 36 years old, but at that moment he seemed much smaller. There was something happening inside him, something that was trying to come out and that he was holding back with his hands. "Mom, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Brianna said before he could finish. "I already explained it to you, David. I'm not giving up my space. That's not how we agreed." And right there, in that hallway, with the neighbor still at the window and the delivery guy who had given up on delivering and stood on the sidewalk listening to everything, something happened that Mrs. Martha Sullivan didn't expect. David took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and then he did something that Brianna herself didn't expect either. He took the suitcase from his mother's hand. Without saying anything, he just took it. And he walked inside the house. Brianna stood there. Martha stood there. The delivery guy stood there. David came back about 2 minutes later carrying a chair. He placed it in the hallway near the door and told his mother to sit. "You sit here, Mom, I'll be right back." Then he closed the door and stayed inside with Brianna. What happened inside that house over the next 40 minutes, only the two of them know. The neighbor later said she heard raised voices, but she couldn't make out the words. The delivery guy left, and Mrs. Martha Sullivan sat in the chair, with the package of homemade cornbread on her lap, looking out at the street. She didn't cry, that's important to say. She didn't cry because she had learned, over 73 years, that crying sometimes draws more attention than it solves. She sat there, quiet, with that silent dignity that women of her generation carry like armor. Inside, of course, was another story. Inside, she was calculating, trying to understand what had failed, where she had done the math wrong, because she couldn't accept that she had gotten it so terribly wrong. She thought of David as a child, how he held her hand when he was afraid of the dark, how she had washed clothes in the middle of the night for years to pay for the private school he wanted, how she had sold the only piece of jewelry she owned, his father's class ring, to help with the down payment on the previous apartment, before this house. She thought of all of this sitting in that hallway chair with her back to the door, staring at the empty street. There are times when you look back at your own life and don't recognize the path. I think that's what Mrs. Martha felt in that moment. The door opened. David came out. His face was different now. It wasn't the face of someone who had lost a fight. It was the face of someone who had made a decision and was somehow at peace with it, even if that peace was a hard one. "Mom, you're coming inside." Martha looked up. "David, I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing anything. Come in." And then came the first part of the revelation. Not the biggest one. That comes later. But the first. Brianna was no longer in the living room. David had asked her to go to the bedroom while his mother came in, and Brianna had gone, furious, her quick steps pounding on the hardwood floor. But she had gone. David led his mother to the guest room, a tidy room with a light-colored bedspread, a window overlooking the garden. He set the suitcase on top of the bed and stood there, not quite knowing what to do with his hands. "Mom, I should have called." "You should have," she agreed. No anger, just the truth. "I know I messed up, and I'm going to fix it, but you're not going to sleep on the street." Martha looked at her son for a long time. This son who had come out of her belly screaming, who had kept her up at night for years, whom she had raised as best she could with the strength she had. This son who was now standing at the door of the guest room, still in his suit and tie, with the expression of someone who was learning something about himself that afternoon. "All right," she said, "but tell me what happened to the David I raised, because this one I don't really know yet." And it was with that question hanging in the air that the following days began. The problem was that no one had warned Martha that the war was far from over, that the guest room was contested territory, and that Brianna, contrary to what she seemed, was not just a difficult woman. She was a woman who was afraid, and the fear of certain people does far more damage than cruelty ever could. Brianna had grown up in a family where resources were fought over. She was the middle of three sisters, the one who always got the least attention, the least space, the least of everything. She had worked to earn every inch of the life she had, the job, the apartment that was hers before the marriage, the careful clothes, the plans for the future. She didn't want to share, not because she was a cruel person by nature, but because sharing for her had always meant losing. That doesn't justify what she did in that hallway. It doesn't justify the cruelty of her words, but maybe it explains where it all came from. Over the next 3 days, the house was divided in a way that everyone felt, but no one said out loud. Martha woke up early, made the coffee before Brianna came downstairs, and left the kitchen exactly as she had found it. She had learned to take up as little space as possible since she became a widow. That was the art life had taught her, to exist without being a bother. Brianna would come downstairs, glance at her mother-in-law, and look away. She didn't curse anymore, but her silence was a wall. David stood in the middle, trying to talk to one and then the other, trying to believe that it would all work itself out if he just waited long enough. It was on the 4th night that everything came to a head in a different way. Martha was in her room when she heard voices in the living room. She didn't want to listen, but the walls in that house were thinner than they seemed, and what she heard left her sitting on the edge of the bed for a very long time, staring at her hands. "I can't take this atmosphere anymore," Brianna was saying. "This isn't what I want for my life. Brianna, she's my mother. I know who she is, David, and I also know you promised this wasn't going to happen. I know I promised, but I couldn't leave my mother out on the street. And who's going to take care of me? Who thinks about me around here?" There was a long pause. Martha held her breath. "You have everything you need, Brianna." "No, I don't. I don't have the husband I thought I had." She heard the sound of a glass being set down hard on the table, then footsteps and the bedroom door slamming shut. Martha lay down. She stared at the ceiling. And that's when she made the decision no one expected from her. Not a decision to leave, not a decision to back down, a decision to find out what was really going on with her son. Because she had noticed something over the past few days that didn't add up with what David was showing her. He went out a lot for work, fine, but he came back with a kind of tiredness that wasn't from work. It was a different tiredness, a tiredness from the inside. The next morning, before Brianna woke up, she came downstairs and found David in the kitchen. He was having coffee by himself, staring out the window. "Tell me," she said, sitting down in the chair across from him. He looked at her with that childlike look still, the look of a son who wants to hide that he's not doing well so he won't worry his mother. "There's nothing to tell, Mom." "David, I'm 73 years old. I learned to read what people don't say before most people learn to read what they do say. Tell me." He was quiet for a minute. Then he started. The story that came out of David's mouth that morning was a story Martha didn't fully know. She knew pieces of it, The marriage to Brianna 3 years ago, which had been rushed. The move to that big city right after. The phone calls getting shorter and shorter. The visits that never happened. But she didn't know what was underneath it all. David had started a small business with a partner 2 years before. It worked for a while, and then it started going wrong. The partner ran off with some of the money. David hadn't told anyone, not his mother, not his friends, afraid of looking weak. He had tried to fix it on his own. And the more he tried on his own, the deeper he sank. The fancy house, the Lincoln Park neighborhood, the suit he wore every day, it was all at the limit. They were in debt. Brianna knew part of it, but not all of it. And David was afraid to tell her the rest. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Mrs. Martha Sullivan listened to everything without interrupting. That was something she did well, listen without interrupting. She had learned that sometimes people need to finish telling their story before they can understand what they're telling. When David finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much do you owe?" He said a number. It wasn't astronomical. It was the kind of debt that paralyzes a person who never had a safety net. But that has a solution if it's faced with clarity. "Why didn't you tell me before?" He lowered his head. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me." There are sentences we hear that stay with us. That one stayed with me. A 36-year-old man in a suit and tie with the weight of the world on his shoulders, worried above all about his mother's pride. Sometimes we think we know what we'll find inside a person, and we're completely wrong. Martha got up from her chair, walked over to her son, and placed her hand on his face. A hand that had washed clothes, picked coffee in the fields when she was young, rocked a grandchild, folded clothes for people who weren't family to earn a few dollars. A hand that knew the weight of things. "You think I raised you to disappoint me? That's not possible." David closed his eyes. "But Mom, what do we do now?" "Now we think together. You and me. First you tell me everything, with names and numbers, and then we figure out what to do." But the story hadn't reached the hardest part yet, because Brianna woke up. And when Brianna came downstairs and found the two of them sitting in the kitchen with papers spread across the table and hushed voices like people solving something serious, she stopped at the door and asked what was going on. David hesitated. Martha looked at her daughter-in-law, and that was when she did the most surprising thing in this whole story. She stood up, pulled out a chair, and said, "Brianna, sit here. Your husband has something important to tell you, and you better hear it all at once because you need to know who you really married." Brianna stood frozen at the door. She wasn't expecting that. She was expecting a fight. She was ready for a fight. She had her arguments lined up in her head. But she wasn't expecting to be asked to sit down. She sat, and David told everything. To his mother and his wife at the same time, in that kitchen early in the morning, with the coffee going cold in the cup. When he finished, the silence was different from the silence Brianna usually made. It wasn't the silence of someone who's hurt and wants to punish. It was the silence of someone who just realized she'd been angry at the wrong person for the wrong reason. "Why didn't you tell me?" Brianna's voice came out smaller than usual. "Because I was afraid of how you'd react. And you thought it was better to leave me in the dark." "I thought I'd fix it before it came to that." Brianna kept looking at her husband, and there at that moment something happened that Martha would tell for many years. Brianna started to cry, not out of anger. It was that kind of crying that comes when you realize you've spent too much time being angry at something you didn't even really understand. "I was so afraid of losing everything I helped build," she said. "And then when you showed up, I couldn't take it. I thought it was just one more thing pushing me down." Martha looked at her daughter-in-law for a while. She knew that fear. She had lived with it her whole life. The fear of having no ground beneath you, of having the ground ripped out from under you. It wasn't a strange fear. It was the most human fear in the world. "Brianna," she said in a calm voice, "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came because my son is all I have, and now I'm seeing that you need someone on your side too." What happened in the following months wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It wasn't like that. It was hard. It was ugly at times. There were arguments, there was crying. There were nights when all three of them were angry at each other at the same time. David faced the debt with his head held high. Martha had saved a small amount over the years, money she had never touched, kept in a folded paper inside a tin at the bottom of her suitcase. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the most urgent part and give them room to breathe. She offered it without anyone asking. And David cried when she opened her hand and placed that paper on the table, not because of the money, because of the gesture, because of a mother who was still a mother even after being humiliated at her own front door. Brianna saw all of it, and something inside her began to give way, slowly, like a rusty door that starts to turn over time. She didn't apologize all at once. That wouldn't have been real either. She apologized in pieces, in small fragments. One day, she had her mother-in-law's coffee ready when she woke up earlier. Another day, she asked Martha if she wanted help folding the clothes. A week later, on a rainy afternoon, the two of them sat on the porch, and Brianna asked what her life had been like when she was young, and Martha told her. She told her about the farm, about the husband she lost too soon, about the children she raised, about hands that never stopped working. She told it without bitterness, because she had learned that holding on to bitterness is like carrying a rock in your pocket. You walk, but you walk heavy. Brianna listened closely, and when Martha finished, she said something softly, almost to herself. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Martha smiled. That smile of someone who's been through a lot and knows that time resolves what stubbornness can't. David's company didn't come back. He closed it down with what he had and found a job somewhere that paid less but paid on time. They sold the newer car. They cut back on some things. Life got smaller for a while, but it got more honest. And the house, that big house with the marble hallway and chandelier on the ceiling, started to feel different inside. Not in the structure, in the atmosphere. In the way the three people who lived there began to get through their mornings without avoiding each other's eyes. There was a day about 4 months after that Saturday afternoon when David came home and found his mother and his wife in the kitchen baking together. A homemade cornbread, the same one Martha had brought in her suitcase and that had never even been opened. He stood in the doorway, still in his suit, briefcase in hand, watching the two of them from behind, talking, laughing at something he hadn't heard, and he stood there longer than he needed to, just to look. There are certain scenes you hold on to, that stay with you. Not because they're perfect, but because they came after so much that their imperfection becomes beautiful. Martha stayed in that house. Not for a while, like she had said. She stayed for good. When David asked her one day if she planned on going anywhere, she looked at him with that calm way she had. "I'm where I need to be," she said. And it was true. Because Martha had learned over all those months that sometimes you show up at someone's door at the most inconvenient moment possible. Without warning, smelling like a Greyhound bus, with an old brown leather suitcase and a cornbread wrapped in paper. And it's exactly in that untimely arrival, in all that mess, that families find out if they're still a family. Hers was. In the most complicated and most real way possible, hers was. End of story. Look, when I got to that last part, I breathed differently. Because this isn't just the story of a mother-in-law who was humiliated. It's the story of a woman who, even when rejected, didn't give up being who she was, who didn't let the pain turn into poison, who reached out to the people who had been cruel to her, not out of weakness, but because she understood people in a way few do. And David, that son who stood there in the middle, learning too late what he should have done earlier, but who in the end did what was right when it mattered. Tell us, where are you watching from today? And what would you have done in Mrs. Martha Sullivan's place, sitting on that chair in the hallway with the cornbread in her lap? Leave it in the comments. I read everything carefully. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you so much for your company, as always.